Peter did a fantastic job of giving a little overview and highlight about what Frank is doing over at the Department of State. And as I said earlier, it's a real treat and pleasure to have Frank out here giving all the things that are going on at State. I think they have one or two things on their plate today, you know, regarding world affairs. So to get Frank out here is really a blessing for us. Just real quickly, Frank kind of really glossed over his background, but I first met Frank years ago when he worked in the House of Representatives on the professional staff of the House Armed Services Committee. But Frank also worked on the Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. He worked in the Department of Defense, worked for the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy, Threat Reduction. He was a policy advisor to the Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Policy. So if anyone knows and was the right person at the right time for this job, it definitely is Frank Rose. And as I said, really glad that Frank is here with us to share his insight and everything on what's going on at the State Department. Thanks so much, Frank.
Great. Well, thanks very much for that kind introduction. I'm going to be relatively brief because I think we addressed many of these issues both in Doug's speech as well as in the Q&A. But if you'll indulge me for about 10 or 15 minutes, then I'll be happy to stay on the panel and answer any additional questions that people have. Again, it's my pleasure to be here today to discuss the critical topic of international collaboration on space situational awareness, or SSA. I would like to express my gratitude to the Maui Economic Development Board for inviting me to participate in what will certainly be an interesting discussion. They've invited me the past 3 years, and I've had to decline. But this time I told Sandy at the National Space Forum that I would do it this year, and I blocked my calendar. As you are aware, indeed, the reason we are here in beautiful Maui this week is the increasingly congested space environment is a growing concern to the scientific community, but also to policy makers around the world. And, you know, as I mentioned in some of my previous comments earlier today, that I think it's really important that we get this issue on the agenda of policymakers. And I think we've actually made some real progress on that. For example, you know, last year, Secretary Clinton provided a statement on space security. And that was the first statement on space security that I had seen a Secretary of State make in many years. And I think it is indicative of the attention that this is getting from senior policymakers. Well, the presentations at tomorrow's AMOS conference will address the technical and scientific aspects of orbital debris monitoring. Today, I would like to describe for you what we are doing through international space cooperation to enhance our global SSA activities. I'll also discuss a few of the transparency and confidence building measures that we at the State Department are working on, and which I touched on in the previous panel. Space situational awareness is foundational to our efforts to understand what is going on in space and to cope with the increasing amount of space debris. SSA enables us to characterize the space environment and to predict the locations of objects orbiting the Earth. As you know, the United States currently tracks tens of thousands of pieces of space debris 10 centimeters or larger in various Earth orbits. Of these objects, about 1,100 are active satellites, and the rest are space debris, objects ranging from satellite parts to spent rocket bodies to obsolete satellites, and I think there's even a toothbrush or two up there. Some of this debris was created accidentally through collisions. Some was created through routine space launches and operations, while other debris was created by intentional acts, like China's destruction of one of its own satellites in 2007. No one nation has the resources, capabilities, or geographic position necessary to precisely track every space object, and as a result, international cooperation on SSA is essential. The President's 2010 National Space Policy implicitly recognizes this fact and thus directs us to collaborate with foreign partners, the private sector, and intergovernmental organizations to improve our space situational awareness, specifically to improve our shared ability to rapidly detect, warn of, characterize, and attribute natural and man-made disturbances to space systems. Having accurate information in a timely fashion is critical for a number of reasons. First, it is critical to NASA, our International Space Station partners, in all spacefaring nations where human spaceflight safety is of the utmost importance. Second, it is critical for U.S. national security and indeed world security to be able to detect, identify, and attribute actions in space that are contrary to responsible and peaceful uses of outer space. And third, given the growing dependence we all have on space-derived information, including GPS, weather forecasting, and telecommunications, it is critical to the global economy. The United States is taking action in a variety of ways to implement the national space policy and enhance our SS capabilities through international cooperation. The United States continues to provide notification to other governments and commercial satellite operators of potentially hazardous conjunctions between orbiting objects. To do so, the United States is working with spacefaring entities to establish two-way information exchanges and to facilitate rapid notification of space hazards. However, before we can provide these notifications, we must ensure that we have accurate contact information for satellite owners and operators. As a result, the Department of State works very closely with U.S. Strategic Command's Joint Space Operations Center to develop current contact information for both government and private sector satellite operation centers. We hope that our space surveillance capabilities improve. We will be able to notify satellite operators earlier and with greater accuracy in order to prevent collisions in space. To this end, the United States is working with other spacefaring nations to develop guidelines and procedures for enhanced spaceflight safety. U.S. experts played a leading role in the recent development of an international standard called the Conjunction Data Message, which provides a common format to notify satellite operators that their satellite is approaching another satellite. We are also working closely with commercial space industry to determine the kinds of satellite tracking and status data and other information that can be shared. Working together at the operator level to share collision warning information will have the added benefit of improving space flight safety and communication among governmental and commercial operators, users, and decision makers. Across the United States government, we are also supporting numerous multilateral and bilateral cooperation efforts on SSA. For example, the United States and Australia signed an agreement for SSA sharing in April 2013, and the United States and Japan signed a similar SSA cooperation agreement in May 2013. Additionally, the Department of Defense has signed bilateral SSA partnership statements of principles with Australia, Canada, and France. The Department of Defense also has ongoing efforts to cooperate with numerous other international and commercial partners to promote safe and responsible space operations, including sharing SSA and flight safety information. On the multilateral front, the United States is collaborating with our allies and partners in Europe as they continue to develop their own SSA capabilities. The United States government is currently engaged in technical exchanges with experts from the European Space Agency, the European Union, and individual ESA and EU member states to ensure our existing and planned SSA systems contribute to a more comprehensive situational awareness picture to improve the safety, sustainability, stability, and security of the space environment. Looking ahead, the United States sees opportunities for cooperating on SSA with many other nations and non-governmental space operators around the globe. Transparency and confidence building measures, or TCBMs, also have the potential of enhancing our SSA by increasing our knowledge of activities occurring in the space environment. TCBMs are a means by which governments can address challenges and share information with the aim of creating mutual understanding and reducing tensions. They consist of pragmatic, voluntary, near-term actions that we can do to prevent misperception, miscalculation, and mistrust between nations. In our implementation of the National Space Policy, the United States has been pursuing TCBMs to strengthen stability in outer space. For instance, the United States has joined with the European Union and other nations on the initiative to develop an international code of conduct for outer space activities, or simply the code, which will help maintain the long-term sustainability, safety, and security of the space environment by establishing voluntary guidelines for responsible use of space. We consider the development of such a code to be an effective, pragmatic, and timely initiative. We believe the EU's latest draft of the code is a useful foundation for developing a truly international code of conduct. The United States has also been closely cooperating with our allies and partners around the globe on this initiative, including our key allies, Australia, Japan, and the Republic of Korea in the Asia-Pacific region. TCBMs, such as the code, can also contribute to the awareness of the space environment. For example, the latest draft of the code includes a political commitment to notify other subscribing states of collisions or breakups that have taken place in orbit, thereby enhancing SSA. That draft also includes a commitment to provide timely notifications of malfunctions of space objects that could result in a significantly increased probability of a high-risk event, re-entry event, or a collision between space objects. Such notifications not only improve our SSA, but they also increase transparency by mitigating the risk of mishaps, misperceptions, and mistrust. The United States is already setting the example for such practices, as we did when we promptly notified Russia through diplomatic channels when we detected the collision of a commercial Iridium satellite with an inoperable Russian military spacecraft in February 2009. This experience is contributing to our ongoing dialogue with Russia on developing additional concrete and pragmatic bilateral TCBMs that will enhance spaceflight safety. Additionally, a code of conduct could strengthen our awareness of the space environment by reducing the rate of growth of debris in the future. The June 2012 draft of the code also reaffirms subscribing states' commitments to the UN debris mitigation guidelines and calls on subscribing states to commit to take appropriate measures to minimize the risk of collisions in space. States would also commit to refrain from any action which brings about, directly or indirectly, damage or destruction of space objects, and to minimize to the greatest extent possible the creation of space debris, in particular, the creation of long-lived space debris. These provisions in the code strive to encourage subscribing states to reduce the amount of debris they create and thus diminish the chances of future collisions. Another initiative that could enhance SSA is the multi-year study of, quote, long-term sustainability of space activities within the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee of the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, or COPUOS, where experts, some here in this room, are completing their work to support in support of the working group's deliberations next February in Vienna, Austria. We are hopeful that this bottom-up initiative will lead to the formation of new voluntary guidelines for collaborative space situational awareness and spaceflight safety. In addition to drawing on the expertise of spaceflight experts, this working group continues to draw upon the expertise and best practice guidelines that have been developed by the U.S. and international commercial satellite operators. Another key multilateral effort, which was completed this past July, was a study of space TCBMs by the UN Group of Government Experts, or GGE, on space transparency and confidence building measures, for which I served as the United States expert. Under the capable leadership of Viktor Vassiliev, chairman from Russia, the final consensus report of the GGE advanced a range of voluntary and non-legally binding TCBMs in space that could have the potential to mitigate the dangers and risks in an increasingly congested space environment. The ongoing development of the Code of Conduct, which I mentioned earlier, is consistent with the final report of the GGE, which endorsed the development of a multilateral Code of Conduct. Looking ahead, the United States looks forward to future exchanges on the GGE's recommendations in the coming months at the United Nations General Assembly in New York, as well as other UN fora. In conclusion, given the increasing threat and hazards of space debris, it is essential that we have robust space situational awareness in order to ensure the stability of the outer space environment, as well as the environment's long-term sustainability. As a result, the United States is striving to improve our ability to monitor, track, and provide notifications regarding space objects. Furthermore, our picture of the space environment is greatly enhanced through international cooperation. Such cooperation with established and emerging members of the spacefaring community and with the private sector will help us to prevent future collisions and preserve the space environment for the benefit of all nations and future generations. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
We have a few questions here.
Okay.
Give it to you. How does the peaceful use of space help or hinder our achievement of those elements in space policy?
Well, what I would say is the peaceful use of outer space is kind of the baseline for our national space policy. If you read the policy, I'm sure most people in this room have, fundamentally, the national space policy is about maintaining the space environment for the peaceful uses of outer space. So fundamentally what I would say is they are two halves of the same walnut. That's what Harry Truman once said about the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. Two halves of the same walnut. But the bottom line is that the national space policy seeks to maintain the peaceful uses of the outer space.
We have a sequestration question. Basically, how much risk is sequestration introducing into your SSA outlook, and what are your greatest concerns regarding sequestration with SSA?
Well, I'll defer to my colleagues from the Department of Defense who are actually working the specifics of this, but it will have some impact. I will hope that of the key capabilities that we need to protect during these tough budget times, space situational awareness would rise to the top. But, sequestration, as everyone knows in this room, it is non-discriminatory. It hurts everything. So it will have an impact. It is having an impact. But let's all hope that in the future, we will have a better long-term budget approach than sequestration. But the bottom line is it is having an impact. I'll defer to my colleagues from the Department of Defense as to the specific impact.
And have you seen the challenge of sequestration? I know that the DOD had a challenge of just the straight across the board cuts. I mean, have you guys had to live with those cuts as well, in indiscriminate ways?
The bottom line is, like every element of the United States government, we have been impacted by sequestration, but we are doing the best we can to accomplish the key elements of our mission in the current budget-constrained environment.
Oh, okay. One more question. International cooperation could help soothe tensions surrounding debris removal systems. How much progress has been made in this area, and how soon can we expect to see at least a framework of cooperative international debris removal? 5, 10, 100 years?
You know, as I mentioned on the previous panel, I think we're at the very early stages of working through the policy issues associated with debris removal, both from a U.S. government domestic perspective as well as an international perspective. But what I will say is that this is on the radar screen of the U.S. government, and we are working it internally, and we are beginning to have preliminary discussions with our friends, allies, and partners, both in a bilateral manner as well as multilateral forums, such as the UN Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. That said, there is a lot of work that needs to be done. I can't give you a specific date as to when it will get done, whether it will be 5, 10, 15 years, but we are in the process of putting an international framework in place, but it's going to take time.
I think we have time for about one more, but where do you believe we need to draw the line on confidence-building measures to protect some of our NSS capabilities?
If you read Secretary Clinton's statement on the International Code of Conduct from January 2012, it makes it very clear that we in the United States believe that transparency and confidence-building measures are critical to maintaining the long-term sustainability and security of the space environment. At the same time, Secretary Clinton said very clearly, we will protect our sensitive national security space capabilities. But in my view, this is not an either-or. I think we can have our cake and eat it too. One of the things I always like to say, the U.S. approach to transparency and confidence-building measures in outer space is the best story never told. If you look at things like the draft code of conduct or the GGE report on space transparency and confidence-building measures, and you look at the recommendations that these reports make and what they encourage states to do, the United States is doing about 95% of those recommendations already. Our view with things like the Code of Conduct and the GGE is we should get the other nations around the world to implement U.S. practices. So I think that's a kind of a false choice between transparency and confidence-building measures and protecting our national security space capabilities. I think we can do both, and we are doing both.
Thank you so much, Frank. I really appreciate it. And you just even built on more of what you had mentioned earlier. And again, as Peter had mentioned, your job jar is just immense, and you did a fantastic job kind of executing on what you guys are doing. At this time, I was like if our next panel could come up, the second panel on the International Space Situational Awareness Cooperation, Colonel Vidmar and your group. We found that last year this is such an important panel that it really called for two different panels, just a wide array of views and the international cooperation. So, I just want to quickly introduce to you the folks that don't know Colonel Vidmar, just give a little background on what Mark's been doing over the past 26 or so years, in less than 30 seconds or more. But Mark did have a distinguished 26-year Air Force career that he just finished up about a year ago, I believe, where he was working at STRATCOM, and now he is supporting STRATCOM's Global Strike Capabilities Division, providing legislative affairs and congressional engagements assistance for nuclear matters. He also provides space operations, surveillance, and space control subject matter expertise to the combatant commanders and the subordinate component command staffs. One of the critical things that we have engaged Mark with over the years is when he was at STRATCOM, his role of bringing in the international community to form more of a combined or a coalition joint space operations center. And I think that his work there was imperative for the communication and and collaboration that's going on in the international community. And aside from that, from what I understand from others, he's quite an excellent cook, and that's probably one of your favorite hobbies that you have outside of doing, international space situation awareness. So without further ado, Colonel Mark Vidmar. Thank you.
Thank you. And actually, the fact is I like to eat, and therefore I have to try to cook. Somebody once told me that you're getting old when you have to use reading glasses, and I can't remember what the other thing was. So again, I'd like to add my thanks to the Maui Economic Development Board, and particularly to Sandy and Lori and Jeannie for putting this together. I appreciate all that. And I've got several pages of notes, and Elle was giving me a hard time here because I've scratched all over them. And what that really is when Dr. Austin was up here, and then Doug Lavero and Mr. Rose were speaking, I was lining through bits and pieces, and I think I have no speech left here. So that may be good. I don't know. So again, Mark Vidmar, I'm with Cytor Corporation, 18 years of military experience in SSA and space control, and spent some time up in Cheyenne Mountain at the time under U.S. Space Command. And then I later got to command, I was very fortunate, got to command that same unit, which was by then called the 1st Space Control Squadron prior to its move out to Vandenberg. And then speaking of that, I was at the JSPOC when it was still called the AFSPOC, and then again later as the JSPOC, and did some space systems acquisition down in Los Angeles. And most recently, as you heard, I was out at US Stratcom working with several of these fine folks putting together the Combined Space Operations Initiative that General Kaler was heading up. It was a great capstone assignment for me, got to use a lot of different aspects of my career, and really enjoyed the opportunity to work with our partners in collaboration here. I'm now working in legislative affairs in Stratcom, and I'm told that it's best to start off with some humor and then give a little bit of a bikini talk. And so before I turn it over to the other panel members here, I did want to mention that I have to be careful. I promised I would not joke about the Congressional Appropriations Committees, so I'll just joke about Congress in general. The whole saying of if pro is the opposite of con, then what exactly is the opposite of progress? Congress, yeah. And it says Congress is so strange. A man gets up to speak, says nothing, nobody listens, and then everybody disagrees. That about sums it up. It occurs to me that the real difference between death and taxes is death does not get worse every time Congress meets. And so even for us that are passionate about space, some of us could not imagine life getting more complex and frustrating, but apparently Congress can. And they do that every year. But at the end of the day, I worry because as a casual student of history, I know that ancient Rome fell because they had a Senate. We have a Senate and a House. What's going to happen to us? So there you go. So now for the bikini talk, since my career as a stand-up comedian just came to a brief end. If you don't know what bikini talk is, it's going to be, my goal is to keep it short enough to get your interest, but long enough to cover the facts. So there you go. A couple of items that we want to talk about today, and we're going to talk a lot about with the folks up here, is the international cooperation, particular emphasis today, of course, on policy, and how we can mitigate the risks of operating in space by working together. And so what are those SSA priorities for the organizations represented here by the panelists? What is the status of SSA operations in their countries or in their civil organizations? And then how do we all work together? And some of those things we're going to talk about. But just real briefly, I wanted to kind of touch on a couple things. One, I joked a little bit earlier here about Congress, but I think that there's a fundamental reality at stake that we all have to recognize, and it's hard to talk about. When I was the commander of the 1st Space Control Squadron, one day we had a going away for one of our Canadian officers, and I decided to do a little bit of a David Letterman act, and I was going to give the top 10 reasons why it's great to be a Canadian. So, Elm, calm yourself here. But I said, I was going to say things like beer, it's not just for breakfast anymore. And the Canadians got their national flag on the 15th of February, 1965, almost 100 years after they became a country, and that's apparently because everybody's watching hockey. I'm not sure how they didn't get around to that. But and drinking beer, yes. So I said, well, I'm only going to actually give the top 7 reasons because of the exchange rate. And the sad fact of the matter is, anybody that's looked at the exchange rate recently recognizes that the Canadian loonie and the US dollar are kind of trading around parity these days. That's not a bad thing for a lot of folks, but the point being is not only are the dollars in nominal terms, but in fact in real terms, our budgets have been greatly reduced. And the simple fact is that when we start going out and we're talking about major defense acquisition programs, the fact is the United States simply cannot do it alone anymore. And so I think it's imperative that we recognize some of these areas where we're going to have to cooperate and do a better job of sharing information. Personally, thanks to Mr. Rose and others, I think, in my view, the policy is very much on track to get us where we need to be. A lot of it comes down to the implementation. And one of my favorite sayings It sounds like Yogi Berra, but it's actually me, is half of getting anything done is doing it. The simple fact of the matter is that while we have the policy in place, and I am truly grateful that we have made the progress that we have on that front, at the end game, it is the implementation that matters, and so I think that that's one of the things that we've really kind of got to get to. We have watched, I personally have watched about 5 iterations of the so-called replacement of SPADOC, and the kick space segment, or whether it was Space C2, or whether it was ISA, or whether it was JMS, or whether it was, well, JMS again, because we ran out of names. The simple fact of the matter is that while we have tried to do those programs, it has become increasingly complex and difficult, and we've had these disappointments. I would posit that the first disappointment, believe it or not, was SPADOC. And why was that? Well, if you look back historically, what you discover is that the SPADOC system out in California was, well, now in California, but previously up in China Mountain, was really designed not just to do space surveillance, I'll use the language of the day, what we would call SSA today, but also space control and some other additional things. And those things got kind of commingled. And I fear that that has caused a lot of problems with our major defense acquisition programs to try and go out and replace that program. And again, I should say that some things I'm going to say may not be directly in line with what Mr. Livero said, so please do take this as an open dialogue. I think that there may be a need to kind of rethink how we go out and try and do space situation awareness, and we may have to go back to sort of bifurcated activity where you have space situation awareness, which feeds that foundation for other things that we need to do in military space. I think that if you start looking at it from a little bit different perspective, you start to realize that there is tremendous opportunity for cooperation and collaboration with our allies, partners, civil and commercial organizations, but it takes thinking about the problem differently than what we have, at least in major defense acquisition, for the last 20, 25 years. One of the questions that had come up earlier was, what can you all do to support and kind of push some of these different ideas and some of these different things that are going around? And we talked a lot about going to see congressmen, talking to staffers and things, and I would just mention that while budget issues are a problem, and that's on the appropriation side, don't forget about the authorizers from whom we often get directive congressional language. And so when you start talking about things like how we implement our programs, how we build our SSA programs, how you get to where the rubber meets the road and actually go out and do these things, that may be an opportunity for companies and civil organizations to go out there and talk about how we can better force the policies, which are very good, in my opinion, to be implemented. So I think that there's a tremendous amount of opportunity, but it's going to take us actually getting out and doing it. As I said, half of getting anything done is doing it. And I think that the panel here, we're going to talk a little bit about what their SSA priorities are and what the goals and objectives are, and hopefully during the course of this week here comes some new, fresh ideas on how we might be able to better position ourselves to actually to move the ball forward. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Lieutenant Colonel L. Agnew from the Canadian Space Forces for introduction and comments.
Thank you, sir. Aloha. Canada's had a long history in space, driven in no small part by the uniqueness of our nation. We possess a large landmass, the second largest in the world. We border 3 oceans with approximately 200,000 kilometers of coastline. In addition to the uniqueness of our geography, we have a rather small population, about the size of California, to put it in perspective, all centered primarily within 200 kilometers of the border with the United States. This means Canada has a unique challenge that few, with the possible exception of my Australian colleague here, can appreciate. These challenges drive an ever-increasing dependence on space capabilities and reinforce that assured access to space capabilities is essential to conducting Canadian Armed Forces operations and promoting Canada's national interests. Whether establishing communication over our vast geographical distance to and through low-density populated areas, securing our borders and oceans approaches, or protecting the sovereignty of our vast Arctic region, the Government of Canada and the Department of National Defence have recognized the value of space capabilities and their intrinsic ability to meet our unique needs. In our ongoing effort to address our particular needs, our nation and military have implemented a number of programs, including the provision of search and rescue repeaters under the Coast Pass SARSET agreement, the delivery of our Joint Space Support Program shelters, and the recent government announcement of the Canadian Space Agency-led RadarSat Constellation mission, a constellation of 3 synthetic aperture radar satellites that will provide daily coverage of Canada and our maritime approaches. Within the Canadian Armed Forces, we have been working with other government departments, most notably the Canadian Space Agency, to develop space capabilities to support the men and women of the Canadian Armed Forces, both at home and abroad. And we had done it rather well under the Director of Space Development. But in 2011, there was a recognition that we need to operationalize these space capabilities with the appointment of the Director General Space, Brigadier General Petrie, my boss. This focus on operationalizing space capabilities led to the stand-up in 2012 of a nascent Canadian Space Operations Cell, nothing like your Joint Space Operations Center, very small, within our combined Joint Operations Center in Ottawa. This small cadre, currently less than 20 people, will double in size over the next few years and will form the nucleus of our expanding space operations capability. This capability will eventually include orbital analysis functions, conjunction assessment support, space planners, trainers, standardization and exercises, and deployable space support teams. However, we recognize that we cannot do this alone. We work very closely with our partners at the Canadian Space Agency for conjunction assessment expertise and support them in their efforts to enhance the support provided to the Government of Canada and Canadian industry. We work with our partners at Environment Canada to capitalize on their expertise in space weather, especially as it pertains to the northern latitudes. We worked with the scientists at Defense Research and Development to develop new capabilities and optimize existing systems. And finally, we are working with our closest allies on developing a construct that will allow for the sharing of information on space situational awareness and collaboration on other space capabilities to maintain the strategic advantage that space provides to Canada and our allies. The topic of this panel is SSA collaboration. We in Canada have been in close cooperation with the U.S. since the beginning of space flight. In the early 1960s, the U.S. Air Force transferred a Baker-Nunn camera to the Canadian Armed Forces that was eventually installed in Cold Lake, Alberta. And you know, if Canadians call it Cold Lake, it's cold. Followed by a second camera and telescope in St. Margaret's, Nova Scotia. These sites were early space object trackers and demonstrated our commitment to ensuring the safety of the space environment. In addition, as part of our commitment to North American Aerospace Defense, or NORAD, we have been co-manning space surveillance and missile warning sites since the 1980s. Although the primary mission of these sites is missile warning for the protection of North America, they have long been strong contributors to the space surveillance network and provide extremely accurate data to enhance the space track catalog. Although Canada has not had a space surveillance capability since the closure of those Baker-Nunn sites in the 1990s, we have recently re-entered the SSN, first with our ground-based optical sites, and now with the about-to-be-certified Sapphire space surveillance satellite. This commitment to SSA will continue with the development of our new Surveillance of Space 2 sensor, commonly known as Bluestone, that's currently in its operational analysis phase of the project definition. This investment in technology and capability highlights Canada's determination to ensure safe and unhindered access to space. We support the vision of space as a global commons, with equal and unfettered access to all. In fact, Canada, along with a number of other nations and NATO ACT, recently participated in the Multinational Experiment 7, looking at the protection of the global commons. Our focus area was the protection of space, and Canada led the mitigation stream of that effort. We proposed collaboration as a mitigation concept, and through our limited experiment, validated the utility of collaboration with our allies in various space missions including SSA. Space capabilities are so pervasive that they are often taken for granted. We expect that we will always have access to the GPS signal, whether to find our way around a new region or to deliver precision-guided munitions. We expect that we will always have worldwide communications for command and control of our troops, and will always have access to the ISR products necessary for operations. However, the reality is much different. We all know about the congested, competitive, contested nature of space. Our increasing dependence on space comes at a time of increasing concerns over the lack of norms and regulations in space. Constrained by resource availability, this is the time we need to focus on building the policies and relationships that will allow like-minded nations to work together to maintain the strategic advantage space offers. Recognizing the importance of collaborative efforts in meeting our objectives in space, the Department of National Defense participated in the wideband Global SATCOM and Advanced EHF satellite system. Our participation in these efforts have provided the Canadian Armed Forces with a much-needed capability, a capability we could have never achieved on our own. And although the panel members here today are representative of their national and military space capabilities, we must be cognizant of the requirement of our civilian counterparts and commercial partners. Defense-related initiatives extend far beyond national defense. Increasingly, governments and militaries are utilizing commercial partners to provide or augment our critical space effects. Commercial satellite owner-operators share our concern for the safety and security of space and could and should be strong partners in making this happen. In addition to collaborating across borders, we must develop robust mechanisms to cooperate and share information and data across governmental and commercial enterprises. To summarize, the Canadian Armed Forces recognizes the importance of space capabilities to successfully fulfilling their mandate and are committed to the safety and security of the environment. We understand that this cannot be done alone, and we will continue to work with other government departments, commercial partners, and like-minded nations to ensure continued access to space. Mahalo.
Thank you very much, Elle. I'd like to go ahead and turn it over now to Group Captain Colin Thompson from the Royal Australian Air Force. And the main thing you need to know is he's a plant. He's not really Australian, he's actually from Scotland. No, I'm just giving him a hard time here because I can. No, Colin has been a great partner in the Combined Space Operations Initiative as well as Elle, and he brings a very different perspective, being in kind of a different part of the world. And so I'd like to turn it over to you for your comments, sir.
Could I get a little clicker for my... yeah. Aloha. So I'm going to do my presentation in two different ways compared to everybody else this morning. You all thought you might get through the morning without any PowerPoint. Well, you're wrong. I've got 8 slides only, so it's not a great deal. And the second thing I'm going to do differently, and it's just been mentioned, is that I'm going to do it with a different accent. And I think that's appropriate for an international panel, albeit my accent doesn't represent the country I'm here representing. Because, yes, as Mark said, I was born, raised and educated in Scotland. I then joined the Royal Air Force, the UK Air Force, and did a 16 years permanent commission before transferring to the Australian Air Force in the year 2000. So I guess my experience is unique being in well, it's not unique being in 2 air forces because many people have done that sort of thing, but it's unique in that I've worked space from within 2 air forces. I was a squadron commander at a 1001 signals unit in the UK, the unit that operated the Skynet 4, as it was then, constellation of SATCOM satellites before going to Australia, working again in SATCOM, as well as in the initial Space Directorate back in 2003 to 2005, and then coming back into the Defence Space Coordinating Office as the Director in 2011. So I guess with that, I'm doing this as a very international type person because, of course, being Scottish makes me British, makes me European, and now as a dual national Australian as well. So I come with that background. So reliance on space for the ADF being the Australian Defence Force. Like many high-tech defence forces, we recognise that we are reliant on space data through space or from space in all our operations and our exercises. And you would expect most countries to say that, but Australia is slightly different in the sense that we actually don't operate any satellites. So we get our data through our relationships, either commercial or military. And therefore, up till very recently, we have expected that data to be there for us, and the ability for that data, the assurance of that data was done by others. However, by our moves into the SSA regime, as I'll talk about, you'll notice that we're now taking notice and want to be involved and will be a participant and a contributor to that reliance on space, on making sure that the mission and the data is there for us to use. Yeah, so that number comes up, and that's a very interesting and very timely number in that the capabilities we've got, somebody did an analysis on how many of our capabilities had a direct reliance on space, and it came up as 54%. And you might think, well, that's not a huge number. However, on Saturday, as those that are tuned into the international scene might be aware, Australia had an election. And it was a landslide election. We're changing government from Labour to the coalition. And once all the preferences are counted, the number that comes up as being what their landslide victory represents was 54%. So if the government can say a landslide is 54%, I can say that our reliance on space is also a landslide, and it's 54% also, or give or take 1 or 2%. So that's our reliance. So with respect to what we're actually doing and getting involved in, there is the 3 initiatives that we're actively involved in as far as space is concerned, and that is the SWE-band space surveillance radar. That is a joint capability where we're actually taking a radar from Antigua. A US radar is being moved to Western Australia and is going to be involved, and for the first time give an SSA view from Australia, from the Southern Hemisphere. And it's timely as well in that there's been a lot of talk over the years in doing this, and I can report that 3 weeks ago an Air National Guard, US Air Force, arrived in Australia and started to do the build. So there's a bunch of them out there in quite a remote part of Australia, digging holes and pouring concrete. So it's no longer we are on the cusp of or about to do, it's actually begun as far as the construction and the move of that radar is concerned. The second initiative is looking at a company, EOS, who is represented here at this conference, in how we can use the data, the tracking data that they can sense using optical and laser techniques, how that accurate trajectory information can be fed into the Space Situation Awareness Network, the SSN. And the third one is the Space Surveillance Telescope. Again, Australia's actively working with the US Air Force and DARPA to look at moving that Space Surveillance Telescope from New Mexico to Western Australia as well. The location's not yet been announced, but we've got one in mind, and we're going through all the works to look at the suitability of that site. And once all those sort of boxes are ticked and government have been told of the preference, that will be announced. Now, as far as the policies, etc., within Australia. We have, last year, we sent out, the Australian satellite utilisation policy was issued. And for some, it came out and some wondered at the name, because it started off as the Australian Space Policy, and through the committee process, through the approvals process, it changed to the Satellite Utilisation Policy. And that happened at the government level within the cabinet rooms. And what the discussion was and why it changed, I'm not actually 100% sure. Therefore, I can't sort of pass that on to you. I guess we'll find in what is 20 or 30 years when those discussions are released, we can then look back and find out why it was exactly done. But I think it's appropriate because it reflects what I said at the start, in that, you know, militarily we don't have satellites. Commercially, we have just got some SATCOM providers who have satellites, our Optus provider. Therefore, we're not a big user of space. So as far as having space assets, then therefore to talk about how we use satellites and how we utilise that data was more appropriate, and therefore didn't include any aspirations to do space, space exploration, and it didn't cover our astronomy community as well. Therefore, the name, I think, is more spot on as far as describing what the policy was there to actually fulfil. As far as the defence policy, that's now been worked on to correlate with the national Australian policies. We have recently signed MOUs for the C-band, and also, as mentioned already this morning, the SSA data sharing agreement, of which Australia was the first signatory. We sign anything. Moving on, although we've changed government in the run-up to the election, the previous government released a defence white paper. And in that white paper, as was in the 2009, space situation awareness did get a mention as being an important thing for Australia to be involved in and to be included in, because we see that as, you know, strengthening our mission, improving our assurance to that space data. So what does Australia bring, as well as to SSA, that as well as these sensors that we have there? Well, it's our geography is very important in that it's in the southern hemisphere. It gives us that view of the southern hemisphere that has been missing within SSA up to this point. It also enables us to see some launches and re-entries where there was a blind spot, and give us that southern hemisphere view of the objects and ability to track them. And also, by doing this, Australia wants to burden share and be involved by having those jointly operated sensors, being involved in the analysis that feeds into the Space Situation Awareness Network, and not just for the objects, but also for the spectrum issue. And that just a little graphic there that just gives you a representation of should all those sensors come along, what will it look like as far as giving coverages, the wide fields of view that the telescope will give from MEO out to GEO, the more narrow view that the laser will give to give that more accurate tracking. The C-band again is not a particularly wide beam. It's really looking at reacquiring objects. There's a possibility, should the new space fence develop, to have two fences, that the second fence is penciled in to come to Australia also. So that is a sort of longer term view as to what the capability will actually give. So I guess my last point I'd like to raise is that we're here, and this is the policy forum, and there's a lot of policy work being done, agreements being drafted, and signatures starting to be signed on those. So we're very much on the cusp of this whole international SSA thing, in that everybody is heading towards and is articulating that this international data, be it from the military or this SSA data from the commercial or the other civilian communities should feed into the SSA network and provide a better, a richer and more effective picture in this whole area of SSA, and that's what we're heading towards. But I think the point I want to make is that we're on the cusp of beginning to do that, in that the policy and the signatures is one thing. It's now transcribing that into reality and getting that data integrated into the network and making that a better and richer capability. So that's it from me.
Thank you very much, Colin. Appreciate your comments there. And I'd like to now turn it over to Mr. Richard Tremaine-Smith, who has had a long and distinguished career in the European space environment. And unlike the other three of us, while I'm not in uniform today, of course, formally, but I think Richard brings a little bit different perspective to the issues at hand, given his background and experience. And so I look forward to hearing your comments. Sir, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Just to say I'm pleased to be part of this Commonwealth panel, as I'd be equally happy to be part of the following European panel. So, to carry on, and to be quick, because I think we want to get on to questions and time is running out. So, European space policy was developed over many years between the EU and ESA and member states. So that just means that it made it even more difficult to get it agreed. But there is one, and that's all I want to say on that at the moment. It provides the background. Everyone else has spoken about a lot of the other issues, so I won't repeat, but I will add something, because no one's actually mentioned the Interagency Debris Coordination Group. Now, as an engineer and someone that was involved in that group for over 15 years, this is a group that has actually done space surveillance with initially 11, now 12 members. In Canada joined a few years ago. But it involves already China, Russia, Ukraine, India, and the European countries, and obviously the US is one of the founding bodies of that organization with Russia and Europe. So they have been collaborating. One of the working groups looks at space surveillance. Not only have they been collaborating on sensor work, but they've gone to a point where, probably 9 years ago, an annual exercise to track a re-entering object takes place, chosen from those member states of the IDC, and it's tracked by all of them. Different predictions are done on the re-entry, and a lot has been found out. And an annual report is now written and filed with those member states that they can use to show that an exercise has taken place. So we've talked about bits of paper and what we might do and what is done, but in terms of international collaboration, I feel that that is something that's quite significant. It took a lot of hard work and a lot of redrafting of terms of reference to make it happen, but still it happens. Every year there is an exercise where real sensors from Purple Mountain in China through to the US Space Surveillance Network come together, track objects, compare results, not just of the surveillance and therefore the tracking data, but putting it together with applications that give space situational awareness and re-entry predictions. Many other things happen as well. And it's been an extremely useful exercise, because initially just to have some predictions and to share a little bit of data via as it happens, the European Space Operations Centre in Darmstadt is where all the figures go in and where the comparisons take place. And they got to the point where, for example, better predictions started coming along, but the results and the predictions of re-entry got worse and worse. It's a trivial point maybe, but just to show the value of an exercise, it came to the point where some people were predicting re-entry at 60 kilometers, others around 30 when vertical fall had been initiated, others when it had impacted the Earth. You might think, how the hell could that happen? But it did. And it shows the need for collaboration, not just on sharing data, but doing real things with it and sharing those applications together when we can really get to that next level of detail. Okay, so enough on that, but showing that there are some things have already been done. We've talking about bits of paper. Those are excellent, and those are the backdrop to all this, but some real work has already been done. So perhaps I'll move on as time is short. I've just mentioned space surveillance or space surveillance networks feeding into space situational awareness. We've also had mention about space traffic control or space traffic management. Now, I'd like to be a bit contentious now and say that we're not ready for that, and when we are, that it's not something we'll consider on its own. People say, there's the analogy with aircraft in flight that we'll just have something the same. I think there's a big difference. I think that what we will do from the space side has to work with air traffic control. We go through that regime. I've had discussions in the past with the UK Civil Aviation Authority, not least at one time when they wanted to reduce and redefine where space started to something like 30 kilometers up because it was going to simplify a problem they had at an international meeting. So coordination and continued coordination is needed, particularly something we share between particularly the UK and the US is the functional definition of space, and all these sort of things feed into that same equation. So I think probably best I stop there and allow some time for questions now. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. A number of good questions coming in from the audience, so I'll try to kind of combine a couple of different ideas here that have been coming up. One of the questions here is intriguing to me. I think it's a real good one to kind of tee up for our friends here is there concern among the allies and partners about the fact that U.S. SSA is almost exclusively funded and executed by the U.S. military? And that kind of leads into a couple of other questions that have come in as far as, what might the advantages be if, I'll say data were unclassified, and would there be advantages and disadvantages to having sort of more access to that data? But again, in this case, sort of getting more to the point of, is there concern in the other countries that when you engage with us on SSA, it almost exclusively today becomes an engagement with U.S. military? Elle, I'd like to ask you to start.
Thank you. The U.S. has a very structured system. The Title 10 mission gives responsibility for SSA to U.S. STRATCOM. That's the right title, right? Title 10? In Canada, we don't have such an issue. So we are actually trying to work our way through who is responsible for providing space situational awareness, who is responsible for securing that environment. We've had the discussion with our foreign affairs, with our space agency, our civil agency. And I think we're coming to the same conclusion that obviously the U.S. came to a number of years ago, in that it is the responsibility of the military to protect the space environment, just like it is our responsibility to protect all the other environments, whether it be space, air, land, sea. It's a military responsibility, but we don't do it in isolation. We do it with our civilian partners and our commercial partners. We work actually very closely with some of our commercial owner-operators to ensure that that environment is protected. So no, it doesn't cause us any great concern. Sir?
Like Canada, we don't see a concern in the military being primarily the sort of guardian and operator of space situational awareness. And I think it also goes back to, what does space situational awareness mean? Because I think a lot of people, when they talk about SSA, are really talking about space object identification and tracking, where to me what SSA is far wider than that, in that it includes the whole space environment as far as space weather and how to operate during solar storms or coronal mass injections type things. It also includes not just the finding and tracking the object, but reconnaissance on the object to identify what the object is and what it is or isn't doing. The whole spectrum of how we use space, as far as the electronic spectrum and the potential to deconflict, as well as any sort of anti-jamming, be it or interference, and understanding whether that is actually caused by something interfering with you, or it's a natural interference or an accidental interference. It's also the whole launch and re-entry area as well, to be able to understand and watch and ensure that launches and re-entries are covered. And then, of course, there's the whole conjunction and maneuver. So to me, SSA is far wider than just picking up the object and tracking it, and therefore is I think better used by the military, I think, and also added to by the data that we'll get from the civilian and the commercial community as well, to make it, as I said in my talk earlier, a richer, more effective system.
Richard?
Well, I have a slightly different view, but UK is part of this US Space Surveillance Network. It hosts one of the major sensors, so in that case there is availability of data at a certain level. Having been 20 years in the UK Space Agency, though we had, and national governments have, under the UN space treaties, have the requirement for supervision and control of any licensed satellites and therefore the objects that are in space. Now, I found that difficult with the availability I personally in the Civil Space Agency could get to data. We had to build our own sensor. The Starbrook Center in Cyprus are the ones that provide the data, so that we could actually check our resources in space. I could actually say, right, there's a new satellite supposed to be launched, or we could do regular twice-a-year checks of what was up there, because I couldn't task directly the other systems. So reports from there were quite interesting. We once got one to say one of our licensed satellites was sending its satellite to the graveyard orbit. Now, the conditions of their license were that they were supposed to inform us before they did that. They hadn't, but we found out. And there's many other examples I could give of why national governments need access to data and need it in a timely basis. But even as though there were ways of getting data on a regular basis, we needed to implement our own sensor where there was no control from outside. Also because we could then share. We shared data then with the ISON network, the Russian ISON data network, because we could get data from them, so we also gave them some data. There's no way I would have got approval to get any data from the US SSN and share it with anyone. So the same as with other areas, that there's a whole set of uses, applications, and restrictions that are removed by having more open data and data that doesn't come with a big red stamp on it.
Richard, thank you for those comments. I especially appreciate both what Colin said and Richard there, in that one of the difficulties with where we're at, of course, we've got the policy guidance that says that we shall engage with our civil and commercial partners and allies in order to improve the space situation awareness. Again, the difficulty is again, how do you do that? And I think that one of the things, Richard, you're talking a little bit about is sometimes you have to go out and look at a different paradigm where perhaps the civil and commercial community kind of goes out and does a little bit of their own SSA. And that's not to say that those things can't be complementary, but then you start integrating it more like a product level. And so that's something that I think is a little bit intriguing. And one of the questions here was, back in the day when the Space Surveillance Center and the defense guys were separated, and then we kind of came together, and is it a good idea to separate them again? I guess what I'm kind of picking at is the idea that if you concentrate on space surveillance, and it's not just the cataloging and the tracking of the object, but again, maintaining the situational awareness on the status of objects or what the planned maneuvers might be, or if you're doing pre-launch cool and all that kind of stuff, there is a wealth of knowledge out there from commercial organizations, from civil organizations, from countries that we may or may not have the latitude to work with at a particular classified level, whatever the case may be. And I think that we miss opportunities by not doing a better job of working with those people. And speaking of people, that's one of the points, is it's not just about the data. It is, in fact, about the people and the expertise that come to the table. One of the questions I'd like to ask here to a couple of the folks, to both Elle and to Colin, is the advantages that they see of having people in our Joint Space Operations Center or up at the Buckley site for satellite control up there, and what they see as being a benefit. My view is, as we help develop these professionals, we ought to then do a better job collectively of taking advantage of them. And the construct as it is today, I don't think that we do that particularly well, and I think that's maybe not a policy. Well, I guess it kind of is a policy issue to some extent, as far as how do you treat the data? How do you classify the actual manipulation of data and information? I think there's a lot to be gained by perhaps strapping on a little bit different policy perspective and then subsequently implementing it that would allow us to take better advantage of personnel expertise and non-traditional data sources. So I guess for Elle and for Colin, what do you see as the advantages or disadvantages of doing something like that, as well as what do you see as benefits today of having people at the JSPOC and up at TUSWIS?
TUSWIS is pretty easy. It's a basic operational site. It's your first foray into the space world for our Canadian operators, just like sending a guide to the missile warning sites up at Thule or Clear. It's just a foundational experience. We send operators to the Joint Space Operations Center, myself included. We have guys working in SSA. We have them working in plans and strategy as well. I would say quite openly that they're not utilized to the full extent that they could be utilized, and that has a lot to do with the operational systems that are being used at the JSPOC. If the system, the operational system is no foreign, then the Canadian or Aussie or Brit couldn't actually work on the system day to day. So unfortunately, they are not being given the exposure to the entire mission set that they could be exposed to. Stuff that they can be exposed to back in Canada, but they can't be exposed to when they're working the JSPOC operational floor. What we do get, though, is some foundational experience in orbital analysis, conjunction assessment, an understanding of how to do integration of space into the operational planning process. And those processes we do take back to Canada. I will add just a further comment on that. We are trying to provide more of a backup capability to the U.S. JSPOC within our Canadian Space Operations Cell. But without the policy decision to make that happen, we can't move forward. So we have the people, we have the commitment from our own Defense Capability Board, so our bean counters are telling us that we can make this happen. Unfortunately, we're waiting for a decision from the U.S. in order to move forward on that effort. Sir?
I agree with what Elle says, and putting aside the issues with getting access to the systems and the no foreign and all the rest of it, I think there is a lot of advantages in putting Australians into the JSPOC, into the Ops Centre, and we do have people there. In the ideal world, we would like to put more in there, but we don't live in the ideal world in that we never get what we think we need as far as numbers, and therefore we'll never get a huge number of people exchanged into there. And within the increasing network of space operation centres and the relationships that Australia, Canada, the UK, France, Germany, whoever, are beginning to develop with the JSPOC, where there's exchange of data, there's daily things going on between the ops centres. I think it's more important to really work that as best we can, so that the people working in the international and the US Ops Centre have got a standard level of training, a standard level of understanding, have got compatible systems so that they can see and work and use the data from the same source. Is maybe the more realistic, it might not be the ideal, it might be the more realistic approach to getting that understanding and that unified way of operation. It's begun over the last couple of years from the Australian perspective, and we've got a more closer relationship and daily working with the JSPOC, and therefore it's starting, and there's still a lot of areas and work to do to make that better. Australia is always welcome any US exchange to Australia to do a similar thing, or indeed to the other areas, because I think as we evolve this thing, it shouldn't be a hub spoke in that necessarily where the JSPOC is the centre with all the other ops centres working into them. There's no reason why it shouldn't be a fully meshed system of ops centres where Australia doesn't work with Canada. In fact, we've got a couple of initiatives that we're looking at, or indeed Australia work with the US, or the Canadians work with the French or whoever, so that we all get the benefit and the better, richer space situation awareness by not working just with the US all the time. There's no reason why we can't, do things within the other nations that then feed into the greater good as a product or an enhancement. Was it just to us?
So for Richard, I know that you spoke a little bit about this earlier, about the fact that we may not really be ready for an FAA-like activity in space, but if you look at that FAA or ICAO model, what do you think, should that be a joint international effort? And I guess I've sort of put you on the spot here a little bit. What ought the should we go that direction eventually, what ought to be the controls and oversight and authority of that organization?
I think it has to go fully international in the end, but it was touched on by one of the earlier speakers. We don't have the prerequisites, we don't have the coverage. It was the 5% instead of the 97 or 98% of coverage. That's one of the first time I've heard those figures quoted, but that's the sort of level of difference. And you need the integration of not just the objects, but space weather, as weather forecasts are required for air traffic control. So you've got to bring, and these developing areas where the research and development is still being done, more is being understood, but it's still not good enough to go into an operational system yet. But I think it would therefore be constructive if we had an agreed model and where we could see these things coming together rather than just saying, oh, what do we do next? Oh, that looks next, we'll go for that one next. That's a new label for when because you want to sell it to management, you've got to have a new label, otherwise, you might not get the funding, and you've been doing this job of SSA for too many years. So I think that would, yes, we do, it must be international, but we should at least see what we've got to do, and there's a lot of work to be done to get us up to that level of understanding.
Okay, all right. I think we're going to be able to give a little bit of time back here to the audience. It's a very good panel. I think we had some very good commentary from the folks here. I'd like to just turn it over to each of them for maybe a couple of quick minutes worth of closing comments. And thank you for listening to us today. Elle, do you have a few things you want to wrap up with?
No, not really. I wasn't really prepared to talk about wrapping up, but I think with SSA we realize everyone in this room realizes that working together we build a better picture, a better understanding of the environment, and that's the foundation of everything that we do in space. So every person in here has a vested interest, whether you're in uniform, whether you're a civil servant, whether you're a commercial owner operator or one of the civil agencies. We as a group need to work together to make this a safer place for all mankind to use, because none of us want to start losing these capabilities and be back in the Stone Age. And if you want to see Stone Age, just drive the Hana Highway, and that's a pretty good indication. All right, sir.
Well, I guess my final comment is that I've been in this job 2 years, and I've probably got another 2 years in it. And what I'd like to see in that future 2 years, having sat through and worked through a lot of the conceptualization and policy and putting together agreements to be signed in the first 2 years, I'd like to now see that 2 years, future 2 years, the rest of 2013 and 2014, into 2015, where we actually make it into a reality, where we take international data and feed it into the SSN from both civilian and military, and give that enhancement where the policy from the President says we shall do it becomes we did do it, we are doing it, and get on and actually make it into a reality. That's what I guess I'd like to see in the next 2 years.
Yeah, a few points now. I've got some time back. All launches and responsibility of some government somewhere. There's nothing is launched without someone being responsible and liable. Now, some people don't necessarily have all the tools, as I've already touched on. So one key issue must be for the US and others with a capability to make sure that all those who are launching states or states launching satellites have the fullest information about what they're doing. Because there are some launches that have taken place recently where people, and this includes CubeSats particularly, are launching things into space, particularly when the piggyback launches for smaller and CubeSats, where they're just putting junk into space where they don't need to put it. Now, we know the US has acted very responsible in most of its CubeSat launches. They've gone to very low orbits and they've re-entered in a very timely fashion. But as someone once said, there's no such thing as a cheap launch, or was it lunch? I don't know, but we're coming to the other one as well. But it's a real issue. We've got to not just, it's happening all, but it's scientific, it's good, it's CubeSats, they're wonderful, it's STEM, it's creating. Yes, there are some very positive things, but we can't take away the control just because there are some benefits coming there. So perhaps we'll come back to this as discussions go on. The other one that was touched on, remediation, meaning not mitigation, the things we've heard of, the UN principles guidelines, the IDC guidelines, the work going on at International Standards Organization, which also hasn't been mentioned yet, that's leading to better agreement on what we should be doing. And it can take forms of ADR, ultimate active debris removal, and then particular cases of laser debris removal, the big US project done many years ago, which I talked to Ivan Beakey about more than once, and work now ongoing in Europe, a project called Clean Space, looking at the requirements. Now, the interesting thing about this particular example, laser debris removal, is it would be if it were to take place, and the idea it could only happen if there was international dialogue and communication, is it would be a massive driver of space situation awareness, of the sensor data required both to target, to carry out, and then follow up to see what happens to what you've done, because you have to have immediate feedback so you can look if you're actually going to deorbit something, you've got to know what you're doing with it. Okay, you're going to hope it's going to burn up, it's going to be small things, at least initially. But there's a whole sort of drivers there, and that brings a more general issue. We're looking at what we can get. Can we scrape together some funds for something more? But someone somewhere, and some work has been done, I know, needs to look more generally at what do we really need for the future to manage this space environment which we have, which is such a valuable resource. So that's the second point. And then finally, we've talked about the collisions and the big ones, and we've had the data. I'm sure most people here know, but just to emphasize the point, if we had another collision the same as the ones we've had, it's not going to have the same effect. It's cumulative. The next event will have a much more serious effect and could be the one that takes us to the tipping point. So protecting and not having another collision and hoping it's no worse, it's not going to be an easy thing to consider. The next one, even if it's the same as one of the smaller ones we've had recently, will have a much, much more significant offense than even the Chinese ASAT. So that's my points. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. I guess in closing, I'd just like to say that, as I mentioned earlier, I believe that a lot of the policy progress that's been made has been very, very good. I personally would like to see some progress made, specifically when we talk about data sharing that would enable our partners to leverage not only their experience and expertise, but the investments that they're making, as well as our civil and commercial partners. And I think that that's going to be one of the big challenges moving forward. A lot of the policy is very good, but the implementation continues to be a challenge. And one would hope that part of the dialogue here this week, there'll be some creative thought to how we can do a better job of, again, collaborating, cooperating, and integrating in order to improve the collective situational awareness for the preservation of the environment, both for national security purposes as well as for the economic gains that can be gained. Again, thank you very much, and I appreciate your time. Back over to you, sir.
Mark, L, Colin, Richard, I want to really thank you guys for setting the stage for this international discussion. I think you summed it up really well about the collaboration, the imperativeness of us working together to kind of forward these SSA agendas that we have. And it's I'm looking forward to this afternoon where we get the German, Japanese, and French perspective on this.